Let's talk value. Now, that word can mean a lot of things, especially when it comes to sports and fantasy sports in particular. In baseball, you can break it down in terms of dollar values versus projected stats. And I'm not going to do all that. All right. Look, I've already talked about sleepers and breakouts. These are the young players, those guys that nobody really knows a lot about that might actually do something. These are players you do know about, some veteran pitchers that are just being a little disrespected. It's not quite draft season, but I'm looking at the early ADP across all platforms, and I'm going to tell you some players that I think are going later than they really should be. That also means I'm not looking at players inside the top 100 overall. So let's start actually at 101, a pitcher that we feel like has kind of teased us the last couple of years, feel like he's on the verge of breaking out. Maybe this is the year for Joe Ryan. And it kind of looked that way in the first half of last year, putting up a really solid first half of the season, 3.53 ERA, 1.0 whip, and 124 strikeouts in his first 114 innings pitched. But then that got disrupted in his second start of August, went on the IL after getting cut short there, and it was shoulder inflammation, never a good thing for a pitcher. He came back and he was still pretty solid, but not quite as great. And all told, it was a good season, just not a great one. And so he's still being drafted as if he could be a very high end SP3. But I think there's actually room for more because, look, we could see him take another step forward. That ERA overall for the season was good, but it really could have been better. His expected ERA was 2.87. And the main stat I like to look at with pitchers is, of course, having to do with control, that K minus BB. Let's compare walks versus strikeouts. His K minus BB rate was 13th best among starting pitchers, and that's because he does not walk very many batters, 4.3%, while still holding an excellent 27% strikeout rate. And he also ranks top 20 in Eno Saris's Stuff Plus metric, which is a pretty good sign of whether a pitcher just has good stuff. And he does. Let's face it, he can get batters out. He doesn't get himself into too much trouble, at least not in terms of walking batters. Now, if there's one thing that he can improve on, it's the home runs. He gives up a fair amount because he's mostly a fly ball pitcher. But I'm encouraged also, which I think there's room for more growth, is the fact that his fly ball rate has been steadily declining since his rookie year. So Ryan's ADP isn't really disrespectful. I mean, it's pretty good for what he's shown, but I really think that I prefer him a lot more than a lot of those other pitchers, veterans especially, that are in that range. Some of the guys I've already talked about on my bust video for pitchers. And Ryan is firmly in his prime age at 28. Couple years of experience in the majors. I mean, there's definitely room for growth here as long as he is good with that shoulder, and he should be. I think we can safely say at long last that Ronaldo Lopez finally had his breakout season last year at the age of 30. And yet this year, it's kind of like people are, oh, okay, he's like a mid-rotation arm. He's fine, despite having an ERA under 2 last year for the Braves. Now, of course, I understand why. It's a thing called regression, which happens to every player and especially pitchers. He didn't pitch quite as well as his actual outcomes would say. His Sierra was 3.58, right? His expected ERA, almost 2 runs more than his actual ERA. He was the biggest, you could call it overachiever in terms of expected stats. So yeah, there's definitely gonna be a regression, but if he regresses just back to a mid-3s ERA, that's still a pretty good starting pitcher. And he really is a very good starting pitcher. In fact, according to StatCast, he's got one of the best forcing fastballs and sliders both in the game. I mean, we're talking top 5 in terms of all qualified pitchers who throw those pitches a lot. That's definitely some elite company that he's keeping, again, with not just one, but 2 different pitches in his arsenal. The biggest concern with Lopez really has been durability because after being a starter for the White Sox way back, he got moved to the bullpen because he frankly wasn't good as a starter back then, and he hadn't thrown a lot of innings until last year, got put in the rotation by Atlanta, and he did manage to log 135 innings pitched, but eventually, sure enough, everybody was waiting for it. He went on the IL, and it was also a shoulder soreness issue, but he came back to the very end of the season, made a start after his IL stint, and he was fine. And this isn't the pitcher who's never done it before. Way back in 2018 and 19, he threw at least 180 innings both of those times. So I'm not going to assume injury here. I'm not going to assume that he's just going to completely blow up. And his ADP is fair based on what we saw last year. Right now, being drafted as the SP 48 off the board, that means he's barely your 4th starter in your typical 12-man drafts. Come on, he's definitely better than that. And what about a pitcher who was an all-star last year for one of the best rotations in all of baseball in Philadelphia? Christopher Sanchez was extremely solid all year long, put up quality start after quality start, and of course, being in Philly, definitely a good chance for wins. And the ratios were rock solid. This guy very rarely has a disastrous start, which is nice. A 3.32 ERA for the year, a 1.24 whip. Now, the only drawback and the reason why people aren't really going to get excited about him is the strikeout rate. It's a little subpar, 20.3%. But this is a guy who really, this was his first extended look in the rotation, and there's room for growth because he's technically a veteran in the majors, but not much of one. Got a total of 53 major league starts under his belt, also prime age at 28. Not only is there still room for him to improve, we've seen Philadelphia do some good things with veterans and their pitching staff, and there's also word that Sanchez himself is adding a new pitch to the mix this offseason, kind of a mystery pitch, always looking for ways to improve, and that's a good thing. Now, I can't guarantee that that will make his strikeout rate spike, but again, you can't have it all once you get outside the top 150 overall and you're looking for really more back end rotation arms. I mean, this is as high of a floor as you could possibly get. And the only category here that you might be lacking is strikeouts, but it's not like it's so down in like the teens or anything like that. He's not going to hurt you. And I also want to mention that Ranger Suarez, who was just absolutely dominant in the first part of last year, before also getting injured and then kind of limping toward the end of the season. I mean, he's shown flashes, a lot more volatile of a profile. I do think he's a little bit undervalued too, but between the two, I'll prefer Sanchez. All right, now this one, I totally get why he's being maybe a little undervalued. And I actually didn't really look too hard at Ronel Blanco a second time because I know I'm thinking the same thing everybody else is thinking is 1 year wonder, right? Fluke kind of came out of nowhere, a guy who had never even been a regular starter in the majors, was in the minor leagues basically until the age of 30, finally came out of nowhere last year, threw that no-hitter, took everyone by surprise, was great, and then the sticky stuff, right, that happened in like May, and then he came back and was good, but not obviously as great. But really, if you look harder, I mean, I think there's more reasons to be encouraged than discouraged. So first of all, the sticky stuff thing, I mean, look, how many pitchers are still using it and aren't getting busted? And I don't think it's just that because if you look, after he did come back from missing those games, his ratios in June were actually better than they were in May. And so if he wasn't using it anymore, assuming he was at all, then it didn't matter because he was still just as effective. And sure, he didn't look as good in the months of July, August, but he really finished strong and very strong. I mean, in September, an 0.75 ERA and a 1.13 whip, and that's across 4 starts, throwing in a couple innings of relief in one appearance as well. So by season's end, he was looking just as good, dominant really, as he was in the beginning of the season. And he's still in that rotation for sure. The Astros, have some talented pitchers, but they also have a ton of injuries. Verlander didn't come back. Blanco is pretty much set there. And so I really think that getting him just barely inside pick number 200, that seems like a steal. And staying in Texas, just after Blanco, you see a very veteran pitcher, Nathan Eovaldi. Now, Eovaldi is not nearly as exciting as he had been many years ago. He's got great heat still, but his strikeout rate has been dipping as well. And so, look, something has to give here. You're not getting elite strikeout stuff from Eovaldi anymore, nor are you from anybody else at this point in the draft. Let's just be honest, unless you want to completely sacrifice control and your whip. So his K rate is basically league average now, but still solid because he's going to accumulate. That's right. Eovaldi, who, look, for years when I heard Nate Eovaldi, the first thing I thought is injury prone, right? Let's face it. I mean, that's just what he had been throughout his career. But lately, he's kind of changed that narrative. In 2024, he threw 170.2 innings pitched. That's his most since 2021 and the third most of his career. And you talk about consistent, he had a 3.80 ERA, which marks the 5th straight season that he's kept his ERA under 4. And while the strikeouts have took a slight dip, so have the walks. And that's why his 1.11 whip was the best of his career. So we've seen over the years, Evaldi has kind of morphed into this pitcher who went from electric stuff that you only see flashes of when he was actually pitching on the mound and, mixed in with these bad starts. Now he's just become, I guess, Mr. Consistent. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. You do not have to chase a potential league winner with every single one of your picks. Sometimes it's nice to just have a guy who will stabilize your ratios, give you Ks just through sheer volume. And Ivaldi, I just want to let you know, is now looking like one of those guys. All right, so I've run through 5 starters. It's hard to really talk about value with closers and relievers because so many things are going to change throughout the season. But let's go with one pitcher who I think might turn out to be a steal on draft day. It's a guy who's at the very least a co-closer, if not the closer, once opening day gets here. It's AJ Puck for the Diamondbacks. Now, earlier in the offseason, manager Torey Lovullo said that if he had to, was forced to name a guy for the closer job, it was Puck. So there you go. It seemed like he was him. But now it's saying, well, it's kind of a co-closer competition between Puck, Justin Martinez, and maybe Kevin Ginkel. Now, what's interesting is that Martinez is being drafted quite a bit higher than Puck, and I understand why. He's younger, he's more exciting. Puck, we've kind of been there. We're just kind of tired of waiting for him to be dominant, although he was pretty dominant toward the end of last season. What we have to forget is how he started with the Marlins, who tried to make him a starter, and he did not like that too much, or at least it didn't like him, because he gave up 14 earned runs in just 13 and two-thirds innings as a starter. So they quickly switched him back to the bullpen, and he was just dominant for a long stretch, then got traded at the deadline and was still dominant. So last year, all told, 57 two-thirds innings in relief, posted a 1.72 ERA and 76 Ks in those 57 and 2 innings. He's been healthy. He can sustain this, and you're going to get excellent ratios, a lot of strikeouts for a closer, and potentially 20 plus saves, maybe even 30 if he's the guy all season long, which he could be. I get that Martinez also has electric stuff, but he also has a walk rate over 11% from last year, and Ginkel is fine, but let's face it, he's basically like the backup plan in case both these guys don't hack it. Trust me, I know it's easy to get caught up in the exciting young pitcher who throws crazy fast and think that he should be the closer. And meanwhile, the boring veteran is the one who actually gets the job done. This happened to me last year in Milwaukee. We knew Devin Williams was going to be out. I was all over Abner Uribe, and then he was so erratic, he got sent down before getting hurt. And then it was Trevor McGill who wound up getting the job done. I can totally see that happening in Arizona. People all over Martinez, and meanwhile, Puck kind of lurks in the background and becomes the guy. Those are some pitchers I feel like are just tremendous values right now in early drafts. So take advantage if you can. Now, if you do want to hear about some breakouts, some young players that could take a huge leap forward this year, well, I did that already. And if you haven't seen that video yet, catch it right here.